The first time I realized my brother might actually kill me for money, it wasn't in some dramatic movie moment. It was in the dull, fluorescent calm of a bank lobby at 9:17 on a Tuesday morning, with a pen chained to a counter and a polite woman in a navy blazer smiling like nothing in the world could go wrong. I had just signed my name on a document that confirmed I was the sole beneficiary of a trust worth $12.4 million. And my stomach didn't lift the way people think it should when you become rich. It sank, heavy and cold, because all I could hear was Caleb's voice from childhood, the one he used when he was quiet enough to scare me, the one that always meant he had an idea that would hurt me, and he wanted me to know there was nothing I could do about it. The attorney slid the folder toward me like it was ordinary, like it was groceries or a gym membership, and he said, "Evelyn, your aunt made this airtight. The distribution is clean, the bank has instructions, and the account will be accessible after the probate filing clears, which should be quick." I nodded like I was listening, but my mind was already running through old scenes. Caleb helping me down the stairs when I was 7. Caleb locking me in the shed at 12 because he said I needed to learn what panic felt like. Caleb smiling at my bruises and telling me I bruised easily, so I should stop being dramatic. The lawyer's voice softened, as if he could see something behind my eyes, and he added, "I know you mentioned family concerns, but legally, you are protected." And I wanted to laugh, because protection on paper has never stopped a person who enjoys the look of fear on your face. I asked the only question that mattered, and my voice came out steady, even though my hands were damp. "If someone calls pretending to be me, if someone shows up with charm and a story and a big smile, will the bank tell them anything?" And the banker in the navy blazer answered in the same tone you'd use to reassure a child at the dentist. "No one gets information without verification, Ms. Hart, and your account has restricted access, additional authentication, and confidentiality flags," she said. Then she leaned in slightly like we were sharing a secret and added, "You did the right thing coming in person." And that was the moment my phone buzzed in my purse, a sharp vibration that felt like a warning bell. The caller ID made my throat tighten before I even answered, because it wasn't Caleb's number, it was my mother's, which meant the message would be delivered with softer words and sharper edges. When I picked up, my mother didn't waste time on hello, and she didn't ask how I was. She said, "Your brother says you've been meeting with lawyers." And I could hear Caleb in the background, faint but present, like a shadow standing too close behind her. I kept my gaze on the marble counter and spoke carefully. "I met with an attorney about a personal matter." And my mother's sigh was the kind that always meant I was being difficult. "Caleb is worried," she said, as if that was a normal thing, as if Caleb's worry wasn't a loaded gun. "He thinks you're planning something against the family." I swallowed, forcing my voice into calm, because panic always fed him. "I'm not planning anything against anyone." And that should have been the end. But my mother lowered her voice the way she used to when she was trying to convince me that Caleb didn't mean it, that I had misunderstood, that I should stop provoking him by existing. "Evelyn," she said, "he's had a hard year, and you know how he gets when he thinks someone is keeping things from him." And then Caleb's voice came through clearly, close to her phone now, smooth and amused. "Tell her I'm proud of her," he said, and my stomach turned because that was never praise, it was a notice. I held the phone tighter, and I said, "Caleb, what do you want?" And he laughed softly, like we were sharing a private joke. "I just want to talk," he said. "I just want to clear the air, because I've been thinking about how much we've been through, and I'd hate for old misunderstandings to stay between us." And his tone stayed gentle, while the meaning behind it pressed against my ribs. "I'm coming by tonight," he added. "Don't worry, I'll bring Mom so you don't get nervous, and you can show us what you've been signing." I stared at the bank's glossy brochures and forced my breathing into something quiet and controlled, because there are moments when you feel the shape of the next disaster before it arrives, and you still have to act like you don't. The banker asked if I was all right, and I nodded with a practiced smile that had gotten me through years of family dinners, years of being told Caleb was protective, years of being told I took things too personally, and I ended the call with a simple, "No, that won't work for me," which made Caleb pause just long enough for the silence to feel dangerous. When he spoke again, his voice stayed warm, but there was steel underneath it, and he said, "Evelyn, don't make me chase you, because you know I always find what I'm looking for." And then he hung up. I didn't cry in the bank lobby, and I didn't shake until I was in my car with the doors locked, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror like I was checking whether I still looked like the girl Caleb used to corner in hallways. I started the engine and told myself, out loud, in the same steady voice I used to survive, "You don't owe him the truth." And my phone buzzed again. Not a call this time, but a text from an unknown number, a photo attached, and when I opened it, my breath caught because it was my front door, taken from the sidewalk, taken just seconds ago, with a message underneath that said, "I'm already nearby, and I'm in a patient mood." By the time I reached my apartment, the sun was already sliding behind the buildings, turning the street into a long stretch of shadow and glare, and every parked car felt like it might contain him, watching, waiting, enjoying the fact that my fear was no longer theoretical. I didn't go inside right away, because instinct told me not to, because childhood teaches you patterns before it teaches you language, and my body remembered the way Caleb liked to be first, liked to control the doorway, liked to decide when I was allowed to feel safe. I drove past my own building, circled the block twice, then parked where I could see my entrance from a distance, and when no one appeared, I finally went inside with my keys threaded between my fingers like a small, useless weapon. The apartment was quiet, but not the comforting kind of quiet, and as I locked the door behind me, I noticed things that made my chest tighten. The window slightly open, even though I always closed it. The faint smell of my brother's cologne lingering like a fingerprint, and the chair at the kitchen table pulled out just enough to suggest someone had been sitting there, patient and confident, long enough to decide he didn't need to wait anymore. My phone rang again, and this time it was my mother calling back, her voice strained and brittle when I answered, telling me Caleb was furious, telling me he felt betrayed, telling me I should just be honest because secrets rot families from the inside. And when I asked her quietly if she remembered the times she sent me to my room instead of asking why I was bleeding, she fell silent in a way that told me she remembered but had chosen not to keep remembering. That night, I didn't sleep, because every sound felt like a warning, and every time my phone lit up it carried another message, another reminder that Caleb's jealousy had never been harmless envy. It had always been possession mixed with resentment, the kind that twists into something cruel when it feels excluded. By morning, my inbox was filled with questions disguised as concern from relatives who had never called me before, and my social media showed a post from Caleb about family loyalty and people who forget where they came from, which was his favorite way of turning his anger into a public performance that made me look guilty without naming me at all. I tried to do the reasonable thing, the adult thing, the thing people tell you works if you just stay calm, and I called the attorney back, explaining that my brother was already circling, that he had a history of intimidation, that I needed to know what my options were beyond paperwork and polite assurances. The attorney listened carefully, then told me he could recommend a security consultant and a financial advisor, and that legally I had no obligation to disclose anything to my family. But when I asked what would happen if Caleb accused me of fraud or manipulation, his pause was just long enough to feel heavy. "People can file complaints. he said carefully. And even unfounded ones can slow things down. And the idea that Caleb could delay my access to the money simply by making noise felt like a familiar punishment. The same one he used as a child when he would cry loudly enough to get me in trouble, then smile when the adults believed him. The situation worsened when a police officer knocked on my door 2 days later, polite and professional, asking if everything was all right, explaining that they had received a wellness concern from a family member worried about my mental state. I stood there in my own hallway, answering questions about my job, my routines, my stress levels, while my brother used the language of care as another way to tighten his grip. And when the officer left with an apologetic nod, I slid down the wall and laughed softly at the absurdity of it, because even now, Caleb was still framing himself as the protector while I played the role of the unstable problem. It was only after that visit that I uncovered the first piece of the hidden truth, and it came not from a dramatic confession, but from an old email I had almost deleted, a routine update from my aunt's estate that mentioned a prior amendment, a brief line about concerns regarding other potential heirs. I pulled the document, read it slowly, and felt something cold and clear settle in my chest as I realized my aunt hadn't just left me the money out of affection or coincidence. She had done it because she had seen something in Caleb long before I was ready to name it, and she had chosen, deliberately and quietly, to put distance between him and anything that could make his jealousy lethal. I didn't tell anyone what I had found at first, because secrecy had become my second language, and because part of me needed to know how much of the truth could surface before Caleb sensed it and tried to bury it again. I requested a copy of my aunt's full estate file, every amendment, every note, every legal memo, and when the thick envelope arrived, I opened it slowly at my kitchen table, the same table where Caleb had once sat uninvited, confident enough to leave his presence behind like a stain. Inside, among the formal language and signatures, there was a letter addressed to me, written in my aunt's careful, looping hand, and as I read her words aloud to myself, my voice steady but low, I felt a strange mixture of grief and validation settle into my bones. Evelyn, the letter began, if you are reading this, then I made the choice I hoped I would have the courage to make, and I want you to know it was not made lightly. She wrote about watching us grow up, about seeing Caleb's charm turn sharp when he felt overshadowed, about noticing how often I learned to go quiet to survive, and she wrote about an incident I had almost forgotten, a fundraiser where Caleb had tried to access her accounts after too much wine and too little patience, laughing it off when she caught him, calling it curiosity, calling it entitlement in a way that made her decide never to give him another opportunity. Jealousy, she wrote, is not dangerous when it is acknowledged, but it becomes something else entirely when it is fed and excused. And by the time I finished the letter, my hands were shaking, not from fear this time, but from the clarity of being seen. The unexpected ally came from a place I hadn't anticipated, because help rarely arrives wearing the face you expect it to, and in my case, it arrived in the form of Mary Ann, my aunt's former accountant, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority without raising volume. She called me after receiving notice of the probate filing, and instead of the cautious distance I was used to, she spoke to me like someone who already knew the shape of the problem. Your aunt prepared for this, she said without preamble, and she left instructions for me to assist you if certain patterns emerged. And when I asked her what patterns she meant, she didn't hesitate. Intimidation, false concern, public pressure, and attempts to isolate you, she replied, and I almost laughed at the accuracy of it, because it felt like reading a weather report after a storm has already started. Mary Ann didn't promise miracles. And she didn't offer comfort in the form of empty reassurance, but she gave me something far more valuable, which was strategy grounded in experience. She explained that my aunt had documented Caleb's behavior over the years, not as a vendetta, but as a precaution, noting dates, witnesses, and financial red flags, and that those records were stored separately with instructions to release them only if Caleb attempted interference. She loved him, Marianne said carefully, but she trusted facts more than hope. And hearing that felt like permission to finally stop hoping Caleb would change and start planning as if he wouldn't. Taking more active steps came at a cost, because the moment I stopped reacting and started preparing, Caleb sensed the shift and escalated, showing up at my workplace with a bouquet of flowers and a performance of concern that made my colleagues uneasy, but unsure enough not to intervene. He spoke loudly about family, about how worried he was about my state of mind, and when I asked him to leave, he smiled and said, "See, this is what I mean. You're pushing people away." And later that afternoon, my supervisor asked me gently if everything was all right at home, the implication hanging between us like smoke. The turning point arrived not with confrontation, but with confirmation, because Marianne forwarded me a set of documents that made my breath catch, records showing that Caleb had been quietly accumulating debt, gambling losses masked as investments, and that he had recently attempted to leverage a potential inheritance as collateral, listing himself as a likely beneficiary in a way that suggested he had already decided the money was his. As I read through the numbers, the timelines, the signatures, something flipped inside me, because this wasn't just jealousy anymore. It was desperation, and desperation had always been the most dangerous version of my brother. I realized then that keeping the inheritance secret wasn't just self-preservation. It was the only thing standing between him and the certainty that would push him to do something irreversible. And, as that understanding settled, I felt a calm resolve replace the fear, because for the first time, I wasn't just surviving his shadow, I was stepping out of it with my eyes open. The night everything came to a head did not feel dramatic at first, which in hindsight was the most unsettling part of it, because real danger rarely announces itself with thunder. It arrives quietly, confident that it has already won. I was sitting in my living room with the lights off, the city's glow filtering in through the windows, rereading my aunt's letter for the third time, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and something in me knew before I answered that this was the moment all the careful patience had been leading toward. I picked up without greeting, and Caleb's voice filled the room, calm and almost tender, the way it used to sound right before he crossed a line and pretended he hadn't noticed. "You've been busy," he said, and I could hear movement behind him, papers shifting, the faint hum of a car engine. I asked him what he wanted, because I was done pretending there was another layer to this, and he sighed like I had disappointed him. "I want us to stop doing this the hard way," he replied, "because I know about the money, Evie. I know how much it is, and I know you think you're being clever by hiding it, but you're just making this uglier than it needs to be." My heart didn't race the way it once would have, because fear had finally burned itself out, leaving clarity behind. "You don't know anything," I said evenly, and he laughed, not loud, just enough to remind me that he enjoyed the game. He told me he had spoken to a lawyer friend, that questions were being raised, that people were concerned about my capacity, and then he let the real threat slip through, casual and precise. "Accidents happen," he said, "especially when people are under stress, and I would hate for something to happen to you before things are settled properly." And the old version of me would have gone quiet then, would have tried to placate him, but instead I asked him where he was. There was a pause, a recalculation I could almost hear, and then he said, "Why? Are you scared?" And I answered honestly, "No, I'm ready." Everything seemed lost on the surface, because Caleb had momentum, he had noise, he had the ability to make my life smaller just by pointing at it, and as he spoke, I could picture him convincing himself that he was justified, that he was owed, that whatever he did next would be my fault for withholding what he believed belonged to him. But, while he was talking, I was opening a folder Marianne had prepared for me, my hands steady as I scrolled through documents that transformed his threats into evidence, his charm into pattern, his leverage into liability. I told him I was recording the call, and for the first time, his voice sharpened. "You wouldn't," he said, and I replied, "I already am." Because the truth didn't need to be dramatic to be devastating. The decisive move didn't involve confrontation in person, because I had learned that meeting Caleb on his chosen ground only fed him, so instead I sent the file, all of it, to the appropriate places at once, to the attorney, to a financial crimes unit that took interest in misrepresented collateral, to a restraining order application that included timestamps, messages, and a history too consistent to ignore. While Caleb ranted on the line, his confidence eroding into anger, notifications began to land on his phone as well, and I could hear the shift as realization crept in, slow and unwelcome. "What did you do?" he demanded, and I said nothing, because silence was finally mine to use. When the call ended, the room felt impossibly quiet, and I sat there breathing, aware that the outcome was no longer in his hands or mine alone, but in the steady machinery of consequences he had always believed he could outrun. I didn't feel victorious, and I didn't feel broken. I felt something steadier than either, a sense that I had finally stepped out of the long corridor of his shadow and closed the door behind me, even though I knew the echo of it might follow for a while. The aftermath did not arrive all at once, and it did not look the way movies train you to expect, because there were no handcuffs in the night, and no dramatic apologies, only a slow, grinding shift that unfolded over weeks, each small development carrying more weight than the last. Caleb's calls stopped first, not because he wanted to stop, but because he had been advised not to speak to me at all, and that silence, enforced rather than chosen, felt like the first real boundary I had ever been allowed to have. My mother left a long voicemail filled with confusion and grief, her voice breaking as she tried to reconcile the son she believed in with the evidence she had been shown, and I listened to it once before saving it without responding, because some realizations cannot be softened without becoming lies. The legal process moved with the patience of something built to outlast anger, and as it did, pieces of the truth surfaced in ways I hadn't anticipated, with extended family quietly reaching out to ask careful questions, with old stories suddenly reframed under new light, with people admitting, in hushed tones, that they had always felt something was off, but had never wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Caleb did not disappear, but he diminished, his influence shrinking as his narratives collapsed under documentation and pattern, and when a temporary restraining order was granted, citing credible threat and sustained intimidation, I sat alone in my kitchen and let myself feel the weight of it, not as triumph, but as relief edged with sorrow for the relationship we never truly had. The inheritance itself remained untouched for a time, sitting in an account that represented both safety and loss, and when I finally accessed it, I did so without ceremony, transferring only what I needed to relocate quietly to a place where my name wasn't already a story and my address wasn't common knowledge. I didn't buy anything extravagant, because extravagance would have felt like an echo of his hunger, and instead, I invested in distance, in time, in the kind of ordinary peace that had always been out of reach. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered if not telling him had made me cruel, if secrecy had turned me into something smaller. But then I would remember the shed, the stairs, the quiet threats wrapped in jokes, and I would remind myself that truth is not owed to those who have proven they will weaponize it. The open question did not resolve neatly, because family rarely does, and I still carry the knowledge that Caleb is out there, reshaped by consequences, but not necessarily transformed by them, and that knowledge requires a vigilance I may never fully set down. Yet, when I think about my aunt, about the deliberate care with which she chose to protect me, about the patience she modeled by letting facts speak when she no longer could, I feel grounded rather than afraid. The money did not save me, and it did not define me, but it gave me the space to finally live without negotiating my safety. And as I walk forward into a life that is quieter and truer than the one I left behind, I carry a moral that still unsettles me in its honesty, which is that love without boundaries is not love at all, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep a secret long enough for the truth to protect you instead of destroy you.